Hey everyone, in this video we're going to do another short Latin story. Now this one's called The Habits of the Massagetae, and it's coming from George L. Bennett's Easy Latin Stories for Beginners. Now if you've heard me talk about this in any of the videos I've done from Bennett, I always say that what he's calling easy Latin stories for beginners are not necessarily easy, and they're also not necessarily for beginners. So I would always peg this text somewhere in the Latin, maybe 2 or 3 range. It kind of depends on what curriculum you're following and where you are in the journey. I would say in a traditional Latin curriculum, for middle school level, this wouldn't work. There's just too much stuff that's a little bit more advanced. You probably need a year or two, maybe a couple years of middle school and one of high school, somewhere along those lines, to be able to translate this pretty easily, just because it introduces a lot of different tenses, subjunctive shows up, and these are things that just take a little bit of time to be able to see and understand in a Latin curriculum or a Latin classroom. But if you are at that level, maybe Latin 2, 3, somewhere in there, these can be a really great way to break free from whatever textbook or curriculum you might be following and just read something different. So I like to use these in my classes and with my students, just as a way to break free, read something different, spice it up a little bit. Bennett does a great job of tapping into a lot of mythology and history, culture. There's sort of a nice mix. Some of these stories are more like parables that have a moral value to them. So there's a lot of variety there. And so if you want, use them as a way to test your knowledge and just read something different. Like I said, there's a lot of them here, and they're really good for that. Now, this particular story is coming from Herodotus, and it's about a group of people who inhabited the steppes of Central Asia. So this is an area that the Greeks were really familiar with. Herodotus is kind of fascinated with it. The Greeks tend to look to the east and look at these peoples and think of them as being different and try to understand their culture, right? Because it is just kind of different from ancient Greek culture. So that's really what Herodotus is doing here. But they're called the Massagetae by the Greeks. And while we're not entirely sure who these people are, right? Most historians aren't exactly sure. It's pretty commonly believed that it's part of this nomadic group known as the Saka, right? The Saka group, and there's different tribes within them, right? But the area we're looking at, like I said, is really the steppes of Central Asia, right? That's where Herodotus is looking. So the Massagetae do actually have an interesting appearance in history, and it has to do with the rise of Cyrus the Great, right, and his foundation of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. So if you've ever learned anything about Cyrus the Great, really fascinating character. But according to Herodotus, I think he's the only one who gives this account. He claimed that Cyrus met his death at the hands of the Massagetae queen, right? So there's a story about her meeting Cyrus and basically cutting his head off, right? Tomarus, I think, is her name. But it doesn't show up a lot, but that's kind of an interesting thing to look into. And it's the same group of people, we think, that Herodotus is referencing here. So again, it can be a little bit tricky when you're going this far back. Herodotus isn't the most the most reliable source when it comes to what we call history, but still, there's a lot of really cool things we can get out of his writings, and this story is an example of one of them. Okay, so before we dive too far in, like I always tell you, whenever you're doing Latin, if you want to pre-read it, for these Bennett's text is so old, I would probably doubt there'd be a great area to find, a great resource rather for finding vocab. If there is a Quizlet or something out there, have fun with it. If you want to make one, even better, just pre-read the story, look up any words you don't know. Some of his phrases are a little bit older, but still, you can look it up pretty easily with any sort of online tool. Alpheos is one that comes to mind that's pretty easy to use. But I would pre-read, get the vocab, that way you at least know what the words mean. And then you want to try the reading it aloud, right? So you want to get a classmate and read it, bring it to life, right? I'll read the story to you. Again, my pronunciation is never anything fantastic, but if you can find a classmate to read it to, have them read it back to you. That way you're both working on speaking and listening at the same time. So when you read, you're working on your speaking, your pronunciation, then you get to hear the story a couple times. All those are great skills. You never want to shut off and just read Latin in your head. That's never the best way to do it. Bring it to life, have some fun with it. These stories are kind of short and sweet, and they're a good opportunity to do that. Okay. If you really want to make sure that you've got the translation right, again, I would encourage you to do the read and reread method. I say this all the time: read through the story once, write down any problem areas you have, look them up, try to fix them, and then just repeat that process over and over again. And you should see your problem area list, right, getting shorter and shorter until eventually you can read this without too much trouble. Okay. But if you haven't done all that, pause the video, go back and do it. Otherwise, we'll start with me reading it to you, and then we'll kind of unpack it line by line. Okay. So the story looks like this and goes like this. You have utuntur Massagetae et vestimento et vitae ratione simili scitharum. Ex equis pugnant, arcu et hostis utuntur. Ad omnia auro utuntur aut aere. Ad hostas ad sagittarum cuspides aere utuntur. ad capitis ornatum et ad lumborum cingula auro. Argentum et ferrum in eorum terra non reperientur, sed aeris et auri et est immensa copia. Senes interficiunt propinqui, et pecudes cum iis cocta carne dende epulantur. Terra autem condunt morbo mortuos. Sementem nullam faciunt, quibus eorum ex pecoribus piscibus lacte constat. Deorum unum solem colunt, hic equos immolant. Okay, so let's pause the video right there. Again, it gives you a chance to hear it. Not that what I'm doing is anything great, but still, if you don't have anyone to read it to you, now you can at least listen to my voice and have a chance to understand it. So again, let's go through it line by line, but if you haven't done all that work on your own, go do it and then come back and kind of double check against what we're about to do. Okay, so it starts with utuntur Massagetae, and again, the Massagetae are that tribe we're talking about. So it's saying they use both clothing and ratione vitae, sort of like a way of life, a means of life, similar to the Scythians, right, or the Scythians, you might say, right. So they have this way of life similar to that of the Scythians. Remember, the Scythians are a famous nomadic group north of Greece, right? So that area around the Black Sea, right? This is the group that the Greeks have a lot of, I would say, probably more contact with. And so Herodotus starts by comparing them, saying, yeah, they're kind of similar. Okay. So he says, the Massagetae ex equis pugnant, they fight from horseback, right? So again, a lot of these nomadic steppe tribes are really, really fantastic horsemen. So they fight from horseback, and they use the arcu et hastis. So they use the bow and they use spears. Okay, and again, this is very common for this region of the world, fighting on horseback, fighting with spears. These tribes are tremendous at it. Okay, then you have ad omnia auro utuntor aut aire, rather. So they use either gold or copper or bronze, however you want to kind of translate aire there, copper, bronze, whatever. They use it ad omnia for everything. Okay, so he's saying that for all the different things they use, the two metals they have are gold and bronze. Okay. Then you have ad hastas, ad sagittarum cuspides aere utuntur. So they use for spears and for the cuspides sagittarum, the sort of points or the points of their arrows, their arrowheads is really what they're talking about. They use copper, right? So you can see in the picture in the bottom left, these bronze or copper arrowheads. These are Greek, I believe, but it gives you the idea of how you could fashion arrowheads out of this metal, right? It's a very common thing for the region. So they're using the copper for arrows, right? And for the tips of their spears. Then you have ad capitis ornatum, so for the ornaments of the head, right, the head ornaments, and belts, right, cingula, right, and belts around the loins, ad lumborum. They use auro, they use gold. So in other words, they're using bronze or copper for their weapons, things like that. Gold they're using for jewelry, right? So for head ornamentations, for jewelry. And you can see in the bottom right, this is not necessarily from the Massagetae, it's the Scythians, but Scythian gold is really, really famous, and they're really good at it, right? So you can see this, I believe, is a belt buckle out of gold. You can see the horse. So this gives you an idea of what the Massagetae would have been wearing too, as Herodotus tells you that they have very similar customs. Okay. Then you have argentum et ferrum in eorum terra non reperiuntur, right? So he keeps going. He says silver and gold, right? Argentum et ferrum, or sorry, not gold, silver and iron, rather, ferrum. Silver and iron, they're not found in their land, right? Non reperiuntur in eorum terra. So they're not finding silver and iron. So that makes it a little difficult with their weapons, right? They don't have the same level of iron that other areas do. But he says there is an immensa copia, right? Est immensa copia. There's a large or immense amount of iris et auri, of copper and gold. So for what they have a lot of it, and they're turning into weapons and jewelry. Okay. Then he gets a little more into their sort of customs of the people, right? We talk about what they're wearing, how they fight, things like that. And he says, senes interficiunt propinqui, right? So the relatives kill the old men. It's not the other way around. The old men aren't killing relatives. That would be kind of wild. But it's relatives, right? Their family members kill old men. And, all right, at pecudes cum is, and they kill sheep or animals, you could say pecudes, maybe sheep is probably better, with them. So they're talking about sort of sacrificial animals, okay? So they're talking about making a sacrifice. When they do their animal sacrifice, the old men also get sacrificed, apparently, okay? Then you have cocta carne, right? So with the meat cooked, right, having been cooked, then epulantor, right, dende epulantor. So then they feast, okay? So A quick side note here: they are not feasting on the old men. I remember reading this with my students once, and they thought that these people were cannibals. That's not what's happening here. Okay, so when they're talking about feasting with the cooked flesh, this is not the old men; these are the animals. Okay, so this is the sheep. Very common in this part of the world. The Greeks do it too. You basically sacrifice an animal, you have a big barbecue, and everyone gets to eat meat and have a good time. Right? They're not eating the old people. I just want to clarify again: Grandpa's not getting cooked at this sacrifice. Okay, so they have a feast, but they are kind of killing older members of their people. Okay, then you have terra autem condunt morbo mortuos. So there is a disclaimer here. It says, however, they bury in the ground the mortuos, the dead, or you might even say like those dead, morbo, from disease. So they're not sacrificing people who are really sick. They're saying if you're really sick, they bury these people in the ground, which would make sense. We're not trying to spread disease here. Again, with Nana and Grandpa, right? So they would get buried. But it gives you a little bit about their sort of ritualistic sacrifice, the animal sacrifice, and their death ceremonies, right? Burials, things like that. Okay. And then we get the last line. So you have cementa nullum faciam. So literally this means they make no sowing, right? It means they don't plant anything. So they don't grow crops, okay? Which is very common for these tribes. They tend to be nomadic. And if they're nomadic, you're basically moving around on horses with livestock, right? That's really what you do. So you have cibus eorum ex pecoribus piscibus lacte constat. So their food, their cibus eorum, right? Their food consists of cattle, pecoribus, piscibus, which is fish, and milk, lactate, right? So if you're dragging around a cow and bringing it with you, you can get a lot of milk, which is good. You could kill it and have the meat if you need to. That's really the pecoribus, the cattle idea. And they are centered around the Black Sea. So if you know how to fish, you can have a good time, right? You can catch some fish pretty easy. So that's really their diet: cattle, fish, and milk, but they're not growing anything. Okay. And then you have this last line. You have deorum unum solem colunt. So alone of the gods, deorum unum, right? Colunt solem. They worship the sun, right? So they have a sun god, which is very, very common around the world, right? Then you have hic equos immolant. So to him, I guess you would say, I'm assuming it's a male divinity. I might be wrong on that. To it, I guess you could say, or to him, hic, they immolant equos. They sacrifice horses. Okay, so again, for their animal sacrifice, Herodotus tells us that they sacrifice to the sun god. Okay, so there's just a short, pretty simple, pretty straightforward Latin story again, but it shows you a little bit about the people in this region, right? So it's a neat story about a group of people you've probably never heard of. Definitely won't come up in a Latin textbook you're reading, but it gives you a sense of who's around here, roughly around the time, right, of when you're looking at Latin history, Roman history. But this is specifically a Greek story, I would say, coming from Herodotus. But it's just a fun look at other people, right? It gives you a little look into their way of life, who's living around this time period, maybe around somewhere like, say, the 7th or 8th century BCE, that range. And it is a group, like I said, that does have an interesting part of history. If you want to take Herodotus' account of Cyrus the Great, there's some interesting stuff there. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in these people, take a look at them, right? Try to look up the Massagetae, the Scythians. There's a lot of really interesting nomadic tribes there that have a really big impact on history in that region, right? The Greeks, the Persians, whatever it might be, their own history. It's definitely worth looking up. So hopefully this will kind of or act as a launch point for you to investigating more stuff on your own and kind of learning something new. But for the Latin, like I said, it's a great way to break out of a traditional textbook, read something different, and have a chance to kind of test yourself with a new story, right? Break free. Sometimes those Latin textbooks get a little boring. This is just something different for you. If you have any questions at all, put them in the comments below. I'm always happy to help. But otherwise, just keep at it, keep practicing, and the more you do it, the better you're going to get. Good luck.